I was in need of money. It wasn't the best job in the world, but it wasn't the worst either. When I was called to watch over the construction site, I thought it would be something straightforward. The idea of spending nights alone, in silence, while the city slept, even seemed like an opportunity to find peace with my thoughts. I had recently left a job that drained my energy, so the offer to be a night watchman at a construction site didn't sound bad at all. I would spend most of my time sitting, monitoring security cameras, occasionally taking a walk around the site. Nothing too surprising. Easy, I thought. The supervisor, a guy who looked more tired of life than I was, gave me a quick tour of the construction site on my first night. He pointed out the places as he spoke, as if reciting something he had said thousands of times before. The monitoring room is over there. You'll make rounds every 2 hours. The cameras are working, but they sometimes have glitches. If you hear strange noises, it's just the wind or something like that. You can relax. The construction was massive, with scaffolding and metal structures rising like skeletons in the darkness. During the day, it was probably bustling with workers, the sounds of tools and concrete being poured. But at night, the silence there felt alive, almost palpable. The few security lights flickered from time to time, casting shadows that stretched and twisted across the walls. I felt small walking around. Look, I won't lie to you. Some guys can't handle it and quit, the supervisor said before leaving. They say the night shift messes with your head, but honestly, I think it's just the darkness that gets to us. It creates illusions. He gave me a pat on the back and walked away without further explanation. At that moment, I didn't think much of it. In fact, I shrugged it off, thinking he was just trying to scare me. It was just a construction site after all. Nothing out of the ordinary. I spent the first few hours walking around, trying to familiarize myself with the environment. There was an improvised monitoring room with a small table and some screens showing the cameras scattered around the site. The images were grainy, and the cameras didn't cover all the areas of the site, leaving some spots shrouded in darkness. It was a bit uncomfortable, but nothing unusual. Around 3 a.m, when fatigue was starting to weigh on me, I heard the first sound. It was metallic, like a tool had fallen. I paused for a second, trying to identify where it came from, but the sound quickly faded. I walked over to where I thought it had come from, but found nothing out of place. Some tools were scattered around, but nothing indicated anything strange. I returned to the monitoring room, thinking it must have been the wind or my mind playing tricks on me. However, in the following hours, the sounds began to intensify. They weren't constant, but from time to time I heard something, a metallic creak, light footsteps on the scaffolding, as if someone was walking above me. When I checked the cameras, I saw nothing. The areas that captured the scaffolding were empty, except for the shadows of flickering light posts in the distance. The feeling that something else was there began to gnaw at me. On the second night, the sounds returned. This time, they were closer, more insistent. I tried to ignore them, thinking it was some sort of echo from the construction, but the impression that something or someone was present grew stronger. In the cameras, I noticed something curious. In one of the images, a shadow passed quickly across the scaffolding, so fast that I almost thought I had imagined it. I rewound the tape, watched it several times, but couldn't identify what it was. There was no one at the construction site besides me. I was sure of that. But that shadow, it didn't seem right. What troubled me most was that despite all the strange noises and shadows, whenever I investigated, I never found anyone. I started making rounds more frequently, trying to catch whatever it was in the act, but every time I arrived at the location, there was nothing but the echo of my own footsteps. Even so, the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me. It was as if, with every step I took, the construction site was watching me back. On the third night, something happened. I was in the monitoring room when I heard a sound much louder than anything before. It was the sound of metal scraping across concrete, a dense noise that echoed throughout the site. I grabbed my flashlight and ran toward the sound. When I arrived at the area from which it came, I found a set of tools scattered across the floor. But what caught my attention the most was a steel ladder, leaning as if someone had just descended it in a hurry. My hands were sweating as I illuminated every corner, searching for any sign of movement. Nothing. I returned to the monitoring room, feeling my stomach churn. I didn't know what to think anymore. I decided to review the footage, certain that this time I would have something clearer to show the supervisor. However, when I rewound the tape, I noticed that the images were filled with static, as if something had interfered with the recordings. I could only see short snippets before the screen filled with fuzz. In one of those snippets, for a fraction of a second, the camera captured what looked like a human figure standing among the scaffolding. But, just like before, it was too quick for me to be sure of what I was seeing. Fear began to settle in for real. It wasn't just the silence or the shadows. There was something in that place, something I couldn't explain. But who? Or what? I knew that if I told anyone, no one would believe me. Yet something told me this wasn't just my mind playing tricks. Something was there with me. On the fourth night, I arrived at the construction site with a strange sense of anticipation. It was no longer just a job. The place had become something I needed to understand. There was something or someone there with me, and although I tried to convince myself it was nothing supernatural, each night it became harder to deny that I was being watched. The cameras didn't capture everything. There were blind spots between the scaffolding and the dark areas of the site, and it was in those spaces that I was sure something was happening. I sat in the monitoring room as usual, my eyes glued to the screens. The images were always the same, still, like black and white photographs, except for the distant flashing lights. The silence of the night felt denser, heavier. As midnight approached, the hours dragged on. Every time a noise sounded, a small shiver ran down my spine, and I forced myself to get up and make rounds. I walked through the metallic corridors and the half-formed structures as if I were trapped in a labyrinth. Everything seemed the same, every night. But on that night, I felt something different. As I passed by a section of the site where the walls were starting to take shape, I heard a distinct crack. The sound wasn't loud, but it cut through the silence like a thin blade. It seemed to come from an area that the cameras didn't fully cover, a blind spot between two large concrete blocks. I went over, trying to be as quiet as possible. As I got closer, the sound ceased. I shone my flashlight, sweeping the light between the structures. I didn't see anything out of place, just some stacked blocks and bags of cement. But when I turned to leave, I heard it again, this time closer. It was a metallic sound, as if something was being dragged lightly, but what sent chills down my spine was the feeling that it was done intentionally, as if someone was testing my patience. I returned to the monitoring room with a growing sense of anxiety. Each night, it felt like the place became more alive, more aware of me. I reviewed the recordings from the last few hours. There wasn't much to see, just the occasional fuzz on the cameras, which only frustrated me further. But then, in a frozen frame, something caught my attention, a vague shadow, almost indistinct, in the corner of one of the screens. I reviewed the video in slow motion and for a second saw something or someone passing between the scaffolding. I paused the image and zoomed in. It wasn't a camera glitch. There was something there. The shape was human, but indistinct, as if it were partially hidden by the metal structure. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a worker who had come back to get something. But who would return at this hour? And if it was someone, why didn't they identify themselves? Maybe it was an intruder, a homeless person, or someone using the place as shelter. The feeling that I wasn't alone left me uneasy. And worse, I knew that every time I went out to investigate, that thing or person seemed to be always one step ahead, always out of reach. That same night, I decided to install an extra camera in one of the blind spots. I needed more answers. On the fifth night, the events took an unexpected turn. As soon as I arrived, the extra camera I had installed was already off. The cable seemed to be cut. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. Something was definitely wrong. I started my rounds earlier than usual, alert to any sound or movement. My heart raced with each passing minute. I was near one of the darkest areas of the site when I heard a peculiar sound. It was different from anything I had heard there before. A low, muffled laughter, as if someone were mocking me. I spun toward the sound, shining my flashlight. I didn't see anything, but my stomach churned. The laughter had come from nearby, that much I was sure of. I began to walk faster, checking every corner more frequently. The problem was that, with every step, the feeling of being followed intensified. It felt as if the air around me was heavier, as if something was watching my movements with keen interest. I returned to the monitoring room without finding anything, but the sense of discomfort lingered. I sat down in the chair and began reviewing the cameras again. And there it was once more, the shadow, moving quickly between the structures. But this time, it wasn't just standing still or passing by. It seemed to be looking directly at one of the cameras. For a brief moment, the figure vanished, and the screen was engulfed in static. I rubbed my eyes, trying to process what was happening. With each frame, the static covered more and more of the image until the screen flashed white. I disconnected and reconnected the camera, but nothing happened. Still, my mind was fixated on that detail. The shadow appeared to know it was being watched. On the 6th night, I knew something had to be done. It wasn't just my job at stake, my sanity was at risk. I spoke with my supervisor again, who, as expected, told me not to worry so much. It was as if he knew something, but didn't want to admit it. Perhaps others before me had gone through the same thing. I was being left to deal with this alone. As I walked around the site, I felt a presence stronger than on previous nights. The noises, the laughter, and the quick movements became more constant, more frequent. I felt as if I was being led somewhere, as if something wanted to guide me into a trap. That night, while passing through one of the more isolated areas, I felt a chilling cold sweep through my body. I stopped. The silence was profound. And then I heard it. Steps, slow, measured, echoing against the concrete. They turned to my left. I followed the sound, my flashlight trembling in my hand. My heart raced. Then ahead, I saw the figure. It was facing away from me, standing still amidst the scaffolding. It looked like a man of average height, but his posture was wrong, bent in a way that didn't make sense. I hesitated. "Hey!" My voice came out weaker than I expected. The figure didn't move. Fear paralyzed me. I didn't know what to do. My first instinct was to run, but something inside me told me that if I did, it would follow. I took a step back, keeping my eyes on the figure. That's when it turned around. But before I could see its face, the lights on the site flickered and went out completely. I was plunged into total darkness. I froze. The silence was absolute, except for the rapid sound of my own breathing. The blackness felt suffocating, so thick that I couldn't see my own hands. The construction site, usually lit by dim safety lights, now felt like a completely different place. There was something in the darkness that made the space even more oppressive. And I knew I wasn't alone. I felt a chill run down my spine, as if something was about to happen. I forced myself to breathe slowly and gripped the flashlight tightly, hoping it would still work. With a hesitant click, I turned it on. The light flickered for a moment, threatening to go out, but it stayed lit. I shone it around, searching for any sign of that figure. The place was empty. The man I had seen just moments ago had vanished completely. I moved cautiously, illuminating every corner, every space between the scaffolding. The shadows seemed to dance around me, distorting in a way that made me dizzy. But there was no sign of him. Nothing. I wondered if my mind was starting to play tricks on me. The darkness, the isolation, perhaps it was all building up and causing me to see things. But that figure? That was real. It wasn't an illusion. I decided to return to the monitoring room. The way back felt longer than before. Every step echoed in a way that made me feel as if someone was walking right behind me, keeping a constant distance. The feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. My nerves were on edge, and with every noise, my heart leaped in my chest. When I finally reached the monitoring room, the lights on the panel flickered, as if the entire system was overloaded. Static covered all the screens. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm, and fiddled with the wires and connections, attempting to restore the images. One by one, the monitors began to come back online, but most of the cameras still showed static or incomplete images. Finally, I managed to restore the camera that had a view of the area where I had seen the man. What I saw made my blood run cold. The camera captured a quick movement among the scaffolding, but it was just a blur. I rewound the tape and slowed down the video, trying to understand what it was. There was a human shape, but it was distorted, as if the camera was malfunctioning at the exact moment it passed by. But then, in a still frame, I managed to see clearly. It was a man, or at least he seemed to be. He was standing with his back to the camera, and it looked like he was staring directly at where I had been just minutes earlier. I continued watching, trying to catch any clues. The man disappeared for a few seconds, and the camera returned to showing only the emptiness between the metal structures. But something caught my attention. A small dark stain on the ground that hadn't been there before. Zooming in as much as I could, I realized it was blood. Panic began to rise within me. It was a small detail, but disturbing enough to make it clear that something serious was happening in that place. I didn't know if it was recent or not, but the thought of someone injured or worse, dead inside that construction site made me shiver. My mind raced through all the possibilities. What if someone was using the place to hide something? What if that person wasn't there by chance? What was I really watching? I decided I needed to investigate further, despite my fear. I grabbed my radio and tried to contact the supervisor. No response. I tried again, and still nothing. The lights kept flickering faintly, and the panel emitted a low, irritating hum, as if the system itself was under strain. I stood up, feeling the weight of each decision. Sitting in the monitoring room was only increasing my anxiety. I needed to go out and find out what was happening. I convinced myself that if I didn't resolve this, fear would consume me. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out again. The air outside felt colder than before. I had walked that path so many times over the past few nights that I knew every curve, every scaffold, every unfinished wall. But that night, everything felt different. As if the construction itself was alive, breathing around me. The shadows between the beams seemed thicker, denser, and the silence, it was oppressive. I walked toward the spot where I had seen the blood stain in the footage. When I arrived, I paused, shining my light on the ground. And there it was, exactly as in the recording, a small pool of dried blood. I crouched down, trying to understand where it could have come from. I looked around for more clues, but there was nothing. No fallen tools, no signs of a struggle. Nothing. I stood up, scanning the area, and then I heard it again. The footsteps. Slow and calculated, echoing among the concrete walls. They seemed to be everywhere, reverberating from different directions, as if someone was surrounding me. My hands began to tremble, and the flashlight shook in my grip. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice sounding weak and desperate. No response. Just the footsteps, now louder, closer. I started to back away, trying to distance myself from the sound, but it followed me, relentless. It felt like with each breath, they were getting nearer. My mind was on the verge of collapse. Everything around me seemed distorted. The weak lights of the security lamps flickered, casting quick shadows on the walls. The sound of my own footsteps, mixed with the unknown footsteps, left me disoriented. I knew I had to get out of there. I ran back to the monitoring room. When I entered and locked the door, I heard a noise behind me, something like scratching on the outer wall. I approached slowly, my heart racing. The flashlight dimly illuminated the space, and I knew that something was waiting for me outside. I put my eye to the small glass of the door. In the darkness of the construction site, among the shadows, I saw the figure again. It stood there, motionless, looking directly at me. This time I could see more clearly. It had an abnormal posture, as if it was hunched over, but there was something about its face, or rather, the absence of it. It was as if its features were blurred, indistinct, and then it moved. Not quickly, not abruptly, but fluidly, as if it knew exactly where it was going. It disappeared behind the scaffolding again. I stepped back from the door, feeling the cold sweat trickle down my forehead. Now I was certain that whatever was out there wasn't just a common intruder. There was something more, something much worse. And I didn't know what to do. That night, I knew something was about to happen. The figure I had seen outside, its indistinct form, and the way it moved, had shattered any remnants of rationality I had tried to maintain. Everything that had happened until that moment, the noises, the shadows, the footsteps, culminated in the certainty that I was being hunted, that there was something or someone in that construction site, watching my every move, toying with me. I sat back down in front of the screens, sweat soaking my palms. The cameras were only partially operational, with static invading most of the monitors. I tried in vain to adjust the connections, but it seemed like the entire system was failing. On one of the cameras covering the east side of the construction site, I saw something that made my heart stop for a second. The figure was there again, standing between the scaffolding, just looking towards the camera. This time it wasn't a blur or a vague shadow. I could clearly see the outline of a man, his head tilted to the side, watching, as if he knew I was watching him. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, the camera image flickered. When I looked again, he was no longer there. The static returned, consuming the screen entirely. I knew that staying inside wouldn't protect me. Somehow, the feeling that danger was everywhere, even where I thought I was safe, invaded me more and more. I needed to get out. I needed to find out what was happening at that construction site before it was too late. I grabbed the flashlight, now my only weapon, and prepared to face whatever was waiting for me outside. I opened the door slowly, the creak of the metal sounding loud in the silence. The air felt even colder, and each step I took seemed to echo with a supernatural force throughout the site. The sensation of being watched grew stronger with every meter I advanced. The shadows now seemed to stretch in a sickly manner, distorted by the few working lights. The silence was deafening, and my flashlight trembled slightly in my sweaty hands. I walked around the perimeter of the construction site, stopping from time to time to listen, trying to catch any sound beyond my own footsteps. But there was nothing but the wind blowing through the scaffolding and the distant rustling of cement bags. The figure had disappeared again, but I knew it was close. Too close. When I reached the spot where the blood had been seen on the footage, the feeling of urgency hit its peak. What had once seemed like just a small stain now revealed itself as something more sinister. Drag marks, as if something heavy had been pulled along the ground, leading towards an even more secluded area of the site. I hesitated for a moment, battling the urge to turn back, but something inside me, perhaps a mix of fear and curiosity, pushed me forward. I followed the marks, each step heavier than the last. The flashlight illuminated the path ahead, revealing more and more blood trails, and eventually a path that seemed to lead to a makeshift storage room. I stopped in front of the door. It was slightly ajar, and a strange smell, metallic, heavy, escaped from within. The air felt denser, almost suffocating. Fear pulsed in my veins, but I knew that if I didn't enter now, I would never understand what was happening. I pushed the door slowly, and the low creak of the hinges sounded deafening. The room was small, poorly lit. There were tools and construction materials scattered across the floor, but what really caught my attention was what was in the corner of the room. A large canvas bag, big enough to contain a body, with dark stains of blood dripping from its edges. My heart raced. I approached slowly, panic rising with each step. I knew what I was going to find, but part of me still hoped I was wrong. When I finally bent down and opened the bag, the air left my lungs. Inside was a body. The face was unrecognizable, but it was evident that it had once been a person. The smell of decomposition filled the space, and I felt my stomach churn. The body was dressed in a construction uniform, the same one I had seen some workers wearing during the day. Whoever it was, they had clearly died violently. My mind was spinning. Who had done this? And why? My first thought was to call the police, but before I could even reach for the radio, I heard a sound behind me, something that sounded like a long, cold sigh. I turned quickly, shining the flashlight at the entrance of the room. The figure was there, standing in the doorway, head tilted to the side, watching me. Now, under the direct light of the flashlight, I could see better. It was a man, yes, but his face, it was impossible to describe completely. It was as if the features were blurred, as if he had no defined face, just a vague impression of eyes and mouth. He didn't move, just stood there, motionless, staring at me. I froze, unable to process what was happening. The figure took a step forward, and I instinctively recoiled, tripping over the materials scattered on the floor. The flashlight wobbled, and for a moment the beam of light lost sight of him. When the light returned to illuminate the spot where he had been, the figure had vanished. I ran like never before. The fear had turned into pure desperation. I passed through the corridors of the construction site, going up and down stairs, trying to find an exit, but everything felt like a maze. The building, which I knew so well during the day, had transformed into a strange and alienating place. Every corner looked the same, and I could no longer distinguish directions. I heard footsteps behind me, quick, impatient, and then the sound of something being dragged. The same sound I had heard before, only this time it was much closer. I knew he was coming. Finally, I reached the entrance of the site. I ran toward the gate, my lungs burning, my heart pounding violently in my chest. When I reached the exit, adrenaline consumed me. I looked back one last time, expecting to see the figure, but he wasn't there. Or was he? I got into my car and started the engine with trembling hands. I drove away as fast as I could. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I had just experienced. I called the police, but deep down I knew they wouldn't find what I saw. They would find the body, yes, but the things that happened, they would never understand. I went to the police station the next day to give a statement. They searched the building, found the body, but no sign of another suspect. They said it was possible the man had been there for days, maybe even weeks. Negligence, they said. An accident? Perhaps. But something inside me knew it was more than that. I left that construction site, but the feeling of being watched never went away. Whenever I'm alone, I feel as if someone is watching me. Sometimes I catch a glimpse of a shadow out of the corner of my eye, or hear footsteps behind me. And when I'm completely alone at night, the image of that man with his indistinct face comes rushing back into my mind. I don't know what I saw in that building. I don't know if it was real, or if my own fear made me see things that weren't there. But one thing is certain, the danger hasn't passed. Something or someone is still there in the shadows, waiting. And me? I will never forget what I found.